Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College, and it's my pleasure today to welcome all of you to our Symposium on Place. I'm grateful to all of you who are here because I know that the roads are treacherous, and the reason we're holding this today instead of yesterday is because of that fact. The weather has caused us to change our plans somewhat for the program. You'll notice that the original program included 3 sessions, one on Poe in Europe, one on Poe and the material universe, and then a special library exhibition to be held at the Walker Library. We are planning to hold the other 2 parts of the symposium later in the semester when the weather is improved and we can bring our speakers and we can make the suitable arrangements with the library to hold the event. I'd like to thank the sponsors for the symposium, the University Honors College, the Virginia Peck Trust Fund, and the MTSU chapter of the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi. All 3 supported this program, and we're very grateful. The symposium focuses on the topic of Poe and place, a topic that interests me considerably. Some of you were here last semester and were able to hear one of our invited speakers, Dr. Scott Peoples from the University of Charleston, who came and gave a really fantastic talk on Poe places. And one of the points that he made in his lecture was that Poe is a kind of nowhere man. And so I wanted to follow up on that presentation with the presentations today and the ones that are scheduled for the future to explore the topic in greater depth. That is to look not only at the ways in which Poe did not fit into particular places, or that Poe was going from one place to another, always looking for a home, but also to look at Poe as someone who belonged to particular places and lived in certain cities and had interesting relationships with those places. Some of those, for those of you not as familiar with the life of Poe, are places like Boston, the city of his birth. The fact that Poe was born in Boston is something that was not readily known by people for quite a long time until recently. We unveiled a statue of Poe in Boston, something that was long in the works and long overdue. Places that he is associated with are places like Richmond and Charlottesville, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, and even Sullivan's Island. If you visit South Carolina and you go to Sullivan's Island, there's a Poe Tavern there. There's also an Edgar Allan Poe Public Library. You can see Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. So part of the impetus behind the symposium is to explore those particular places, but it's also to look at places that are imaginary. Poe went to many places in his mind, and you find those in his tales. We're also interested in looking at Poe's relationship with places that he went in his imagination. For example, the idea of Germany rather than Germany itself, or places that he said he went, like St. Petersburg, for reasons that will probably be explained to you today. So we're interested in those kinds of ideas. And we're also going to look at the ways in which Poe has been received in certain places and how his popularity came into being in certain places even before it was so in the United States. And that will be part of the focus of today's session, that will look at Poe in St. Petersburg, Poe's Germany, and Poe in France. So today we have 3 speakers who will be introduced by Evan Lester, who is here with us. Evan is a junior aerospace major. He's one of our Buchanan Fellows here at MTSU. He's also the student, one of 2 student vice presidents of the MTSU chapter of the Phi Kappa Phi. So I will hand the program over to Evan. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'd like to first introduce our first speaker of the day. Her name is Alexandra Yurokova, who works as a senior researcher at the Gorky Institute of World Literature of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and she is associate professor at the Russian State University for the Humanities. She is the author of the Poetics of the Body and the Short Fiction of Edgar Allan Poe, and the editor of Deciphering Poe, Subtext, Context, Subversive Meanings. She has published on Poe and 19th century literature, the Edgar Allan Poe Review, and collections including Poe's pervasive influence. She is the member of Edgar Allan Poe Review and Poe Studies editorial boards. Please help me welcome Alexandra Yurokova.
Okay, first of all, I would like, of course, to thank Philip Phillips for the invitation and for finally, eventually making this happen despite of the weather conditions. And in fact, I was thinking of introducing, showing you St. Petersburg in the 19th century. And of course, the weather here inspired me to pick up this picture, see the frozen St. Petersburg. Well, yes, as Philip just said, I'm going to talk about Poe in St. Petersburg, which may sound a bit odd because Poe never actually traveled to St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was one of Poe's imaginary destinations, rather. So what happened? In 1841, he wrote an autobiographical note for the uncommon anthology, The Poet and the Poets and Poetry of America, edited by Rufus Griswold and published in 1842. In this note, he claims that he left University of Virginia because his stepfather had refused to pay his debts of honor and ran away from home without $1 on a Quixotic expedition to join the Greeks, then struggling for liberty. While Greece was obviously suggested by Byronic fashion, the change in his route seems both unpredictable and mysterious. So, quote, "He failed in reaching Greece, but made his way to St. Petersburg in Russia. There he got into many difficulties, but was extricated by the kindness of Mr. Middleton, the American consul at St. Petersburg. Middleton helped him return safely home in 1829. Henry Middleton was an actual historical figure, and he was a consul in Russia from 1820 till 1830. He was also a southern planter from Charleston, South Carolina. He, of course, would have been likely to sympathize with his Virginian-born compatriot and render him help. Oddly, while Middleton was actually in St. Petersburg, Poe was serving in military under the name of Edgar Perry precisely at West Point, South Carolina. It is even possible to suggest that this coincidence prompted the route of Poe's imaginary European voyage. At the same time, placing Greece and Russia together wasn't that far-fetched. If we think of Byron's Don Juan, that Poe certainly knew, and Poe was indeed, following the Byronic cult. So in Don Juan, in Cantos 2 and 3, Don Juan is in Greece, and already in Cantos 9 and 10, he is in St. Petersburg, where he travels from Greece via Turkey. In Canto 20, he gets sick because of the Russian cold and leaves Russia for England. So in Poe time, Russia had a reputation of a country famous for its cold climate and despotic government. Therefore, it is not surprising that Poe got into many difficulties in St. Petersburg. Above that, Russia indeed had its place in Poe's imagination. 3 years before that autobiographical note I just quoted, Poe sent his character William Wilson and his haunting double to Moscow. I'll quote, "Years flew while I experienced no relief. Villain, at Rome, with how intimately, and yet with how spectral officiousness, stepped he in between me and my ambition, at Vienna too, at Berlin, and at Moscow." So Poe's autobiographical legend survived him and became part of his post-mortem biographies that not only replicated the story, but attempted to fill in the gaps. Griswold, this bad guy, for all Poe scholars, who in fact really slandered his reputation, and so he overtly used this myth, this legend, to slander his reputation even more. So he writes, quote, Poe soon after left the country with the quixotic intention of joining the Greeks. Here he just repeats Poe wordly, word and word. Then he adds, then, in the midst of their struggle with the Turks, okay, but then he never reached his destination, and we know but little of his adventures in Europe for nearly a year. By the end of this time, he made his way to St. Petersburg, and our minister in that capital, the late Mr. Andrew Middleton of South Carolina, was summoned one morning to save him from penalties incurred in a drunken debauch. You can see that the drunken debauch was missing in Poe note, of course. Through Mr. Middleton's kindness, he was set at liberty and enabled to return to this country. Another Poe biographer, John M. Daniels, in Southern Literary Messenger, not only repeats Griswold's scam about the debauch, but adds that Poe luckily escaped the knut and Siberia. The knut is lash in Russian. Well, this comment is as exaggerated as it is absurd. Poe would have never been exposed to a lash, as he was a gentleman, and above all a foreigner, and a drunken debauch was unlikely to be a sufficient reason for the imprisonment in Siberia either. And yet Baudelaire, who used Daniel's biography as his only source, repeated this statement almost word in word. So, to quote Baudelaire, it is said that the situation was so bad that Poe was about to add Siberia to his precious knowledge of men and things. That's how Poe actually became a persona non grata in the Russian Empire, ironically because Russia was the second country after France that discovered Poe and created a Poe cult contributed to his worldwide fame. Poe got into trouble with Russian authorities, in fact, only once, when later in the 19th century his tale Hofrock was banned by censor for slandering monarchy and calling for rebellion. And even in the 1930s, in the Soviet time, while Poe was disclaimed as a decadent writer and the inventor of a bourgeois detective genre, he was still appreciated in the Soviet Union. He was still appreciated as the master of a short story, and his stories and poems were, in fact, they were never denied publication, but instead were repeatedly reissued. Well, needless to say that Poe's St. Petersburg hoax found a warm response in the hearts of his Russian admirers. Throughout the 19th century, it was believed that Poe did visit Russian capital and that there was some solid evidence of this visit, and it was kept either in the United States or in Russia. Thus, for example, Poe's translator, Nikolai Shulgunov, in his account of Poe's life written in 1872, claims, "It is known, by the way, that Poe was in St. Petersburg, where he became involved in some story that cast a shade on his reputation, and in order to avoid criminal persecution and get back home, he had to turn to American counsel for help." So we can see how the drunken debauch became a criminal persecution. Shulgunov ever hints at some evidence of this biographical fact due to be published. He writes, "The account of Edgar Poe's life, his youth, his adventures in Russia, and the publication of his correspondence have long been promised by American magazines, but this promise has not yet been fulfilled." So this myth survived and lasted until the turn of the century, when the cult of Poe got at its peak. Poe was very popular among Russian turn-of-the-century symbolists, who were definitely influenced by Charles Baudelaire and actually discovered Poe largely through Baudelaire. Well, so it is not surprising that the last and most confirmed believer in Poe and St. Petersburg legend was a symbolist poet, Vladimir Past. Vladimir Past was one of the most devoted adepts of Poe in Russia, a god of the usher estate, as he called himself in a poem. Past was often made fun by his fellow poets for his addiction to Poe, a horrible man and reading Eulalum, as his great contemporary poet Ossip Mandelstam would have it in one of his poems. And so, in his memoir book, Encounters, published in 1929, Past mentions the archive burned by Tsarist policemen that contained thing of fantastic value for the history of world literature. A document proving the truth of the fact that has become a legend in the 20th century, a record of arrest of an American citizen, Edgar Allan Poe, at the beginning of the 1830s. It's curious that past confuses the dates. No Poe nor Middleton could have been in St. Petersburg in the 1830s. But perhaps that wasn't so important. As another Russian Poe admirer and translator, a symbolist, poet Konstantin Balmont wrote, "If Poe on Nevsky Prospect is only a legend, all of us who love him should be happy that this legend exists." So this existing legend indeed makes Poe's fictitious presence in St. Petersburg, this ghostly haunted city, almost tangibly felt. It leads us to think about Poe's undercurrent present in Russian culture in the terms of place. So we may wonder, if Poe were really visiting St. Petersburg in 1829, whom would have he met? So an early 20th century Russian formalist and writer, Yuri Tynanov, designed to write a joke story about Poe's encounter with Alexander Pushkin in St. Petersburg. So here's the portrait. So Alexander Pushkin, in case you don't know, is a great Russian poet and a contemporary of Poe. He's a central figure of the 19th century literary canon, if not to say the central figure of Russian literature canon as such. And he's, as Dostoevsky said about him, he's our everything. So you can imagine that his encounter with Poe, albeit imaginary, was of particular importance for a Russian reader. It's also important for this joke, to understand this joke, that Pushkin, like Alexander Dumas, was of the African descent and was very proud of it. In his novel Eugene Onegin, he calls Africa land where my heart is buried deep. So Tynanov's story I'm going to tell you about now was never written. It exists only in the form of an oral record. So here is this record. So Pushkin enters a restaurant on the Nevsky Prospect. He sees a young man there with a large forehead and a strange look, his eyes glaring and somber. The young man is drinking vodka and murmuring English verses. Pushkin is driven by an irresistible desire to come and shake his hand. But the young man gives him a scornful look and mutters through his teeth, "You have bluish fingernails betraying your race." So Nikolai Najeev, who recorded the germ of the story, draws parallel between Tynanov's ending and Vladimir Mayakovsky's, another great Russian poet, observation in his book My Discovery of America. Mayakovsky claims that Pushkin would have never been allowed to any decent salon in New York because Pushkin had curly hair and African bluish fingernails. So Tynanov is sure playing with cultural stereotypes of both Pushkin and Poe. Pushkin was very sociable and liked meeting new people. Poe is instead portrayed as a Butlerian dog genius and misanthrope with a strange look and a glaring eye. His drinking vodka is an allusion to the infamous drunken debauch. Yet he is the son of America, a southerner, and therefore a racist. In fact, to my knowledge, Tynanov was the only Russian writer who addressed the question of Poe's alleged racism in the open. And so the meeting of Poe and Pushkin, both social equals, yet one a white southerner, the other a mixed-raced Russian, could have perhaps been dramatic and equivocal. So bringing together Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet, and Poe, the greatest American poet, at least from the Russian perspective, was quite predictable. Perhaps by chance, yet symbolically, the above-mentioned Nikolai Shilgunov, in his biography of Poe, made him die at the same age as Pushkin, 37 years old. It is also remarkable that Hulda Kartather, in his 1957 La Vida de Edgar Poe, calls Pushkin a Russian Poe and compares the drinking habits of the two. Pushkin played cards and drank just as Poe, but the former to the former drinking did no harm. The effect of alcohol on Poe was, on the contrary, horrible and strange, the only plausible explanation of which could have been his hypersensitivity to a bad ancestry. It's a pity we don't have Hal Poe here because he tells the story about this bad ancestry going through Poe's family. Okay, and again, Poe and Pushkin are viewed as antipodes despite their common social habits. Pushkin is seen as optimistic, light-minded, light-hearted genius, whereas Poe's image is inseparable from his reputation of a tragic, tortured figure and a melancholic poet. Needless to say that Pushkin would occasionally lapse into severe depressions, while Poe's life and art had its positive, happy side as well. Well, a writer, however, who is somewhat closer to Pushkin than Poe than Pushkin, at least as regards the cultural image, is Nikolai Gogol, whom Poe could have met too, because Gogol moved to St. Petersburg precisely in December 1829. And actually, Gogol, in case you don't know, is another great Russian classic. He not only represents dark romanticism for a Russian reader, among other. In his lifetime, he was known for his complex and balanced character. His death, just like Poe's, is enwrapped in mystery. Both actually were born in the same year, 1809. Both were haunted by the image of premature entombment, Poe in his art and Gogol in his life. Unfortunately, Gogol's fears came true as he was actually buried alive, it is proven. And there is another thing, like I put them two together because at least Russian readers, I know it's for you to judge, they believe that they had some similar likeness. And once when I organized a conference on Poe in Moscow in 2009, there were like students come and say, "Oh, is it a conference on Gogol?" I said, "No, it's not Gogol, it's Poe." What is important for our discussion of the place, actually of St. Petersburg, is indeed the image of a grotesque, phantasmagoric town in the work of both Gogol's St. Petersburg and Poe's London. Well, the only difference is that, Gogol lived in St. Petersburg while Poe only visited London as a child and had a very fictitious, a very fictitious image of London, and he was even accused by the reviewers that his London mapping was totally wrong. But still there are, there are a number of striking similarities between Poe's famous story that many of you probably know, The Man of the Crowd, written in 1840, and the Gogol's St. Petersburg tales, like the one that I point here is the Nevsky Prospect. That's how Gogol's tale is called. And so just to give one example, in the Man of the Crowd, the narrator is chasing the old man through the streets of London. He's struck by his unusual appearance and wants to find out who the old man really is. In Gogol's story, instead, there are two young men who are pursuing two young women on Nevsky Prospect under the deceptive lights of street lamps. One of the women turns out to be a prostitute, the other a virtuous housewife, but discovering the truth about them brings no luck to either of the young men. It leads one of them to suicide and the other to failure and frustration. Nevsky Prospect's plot of the failed heterosexual romance, tragic deception, and sexual frustration can be still compared with apparently sexless yet homoerotic tension of Poe's story, ending up with epistemological disappointment. The narrator states that The Old Man is the book that doesn't permit itself to be read. So both plot lines are set against a dense, grotesque depiction of two cities. The city life in both tales is cyclic, whereas the crowd is sliced into social strata and resembles a masquerade. While Poe's flaneur sees London crowd as a succession of automatons and masks, Nevsky Prospect in Gogol's tale is metonymically reduced to the display of overcoats, hats, pretty eyes, superb whiskers, moustaches, and noses. The crowds are thus objectified and commodified, which adds to the air of unreality or daydreaming pervading both tales and at the same time makes both part of the complex vision of and representation of modernity. Unfortunately, I can find only the images of this sunny daytime London and Nevsky Prospect as they looked in Poe's and Gogol's time, but sure, it's better to imagine both towns by night, these deceptive lights, lamp lights. I would say that the likeness of Poe's London to Gogol's St. Petersburg is almost uncanny, given that there was not the slightest chance of mutual influence. So rather it is a question of cultural transfer, dissemination of ideas that were in the air. And sure, Sonia will talk about German reception of Poe, and sure, the figure of Hoffman is definitely central for both of them, and they would both know him. And just to conclude, in his another famous Russian figure, in his slanderous and partly fictitious account of Poe's life, Rufus Griswold portrayed him as a madman wandering through the streets of American cities. I'll quote from Griswold. He walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses, or with eyes upturned in passionate prayers. And all night, with drenched garments and arms wildly beating the winds and rains, he would speak as if to spirits that at such times only could be evoked by him from the Aden close by whose portals his disturbed soul sought to forget the ills to which his constitution subjugated him. End of the quote. And I found a very curious parallel in the memoir of Dostoevsky's daughter about her father. She describes Dostoevsky as wandering in the darkest and remotest streets of St. Petersburg. While walking, he talked to himself and gesticulated so that the passersby would turn round him. Friends who met him thought that he was mad. And it's a bit creepy picture of Dostoevsky, I guess. So Dostoevsky appears to be a double of Poe, at least a double of fictional Poe invented by Griswold. And indeed, Dostoevsky could have taken after Poe's hallucinatory concreteness in his own representation of St. Petersburg. Well, actually, in 1861, he published 3 Poe's tales in his journal, his magazine Vremya, and in the foreword he said, quote, "You will so clearly see all the details of the form of the existence presented to you, that finally you will be convinced, as it were, of its possibility, its actuality, whereas this existence is either almost wholly impossible or has never occurred on earth." Well, I can say that likewise, Poe's presence in St. Petersburg was experienced as impossible yet actual, concrete yet hallucinatory and spectral, being manifested in a whole number of literary pieces, say from Osip Mandelstam's Triste Collins' Poe's Ligeia on a December Petersburgian night to Andrei Belle's famous novel Petersburg, evoking the Basque image of red domino and placing it in the misty streets of the Russian capital. So, as I try to show, Poe, who never visited St. Petersburg, does, however, belong to the city, at least for his Russian readers and admirers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'd like to introduce our second speaker of the day, Sonia Isaac. Sonia Isaac is a German-American Poe scholar and university instructor who has taught French literature at Manhattanville College and Fordham University. Currently, she teaches English and contemporary American culture and is completing a dissertation on the aesthetics of Poe and Baudelaire at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. She will be presenting a paper on literary architects, an analysis of Poe's and Baudelaire's mastery of the creative process at the Poe Studies Association's 4th International Edgar Allan Poe Conference in New York next week. Please welcome Sonia Isaac.
Okay, so my title is Poe's German Soulscape, Influenced by Angst or Anxiety of Influence. You see down here a picture of Heidelberg. That's where I'm currently studying and teaching. As you can see, there's a castle. You can see the ruins of the castle of Heidelberg. So I'll be talking a bit about Romantic ruins as well, so we'll see some other castles soon. Edgar Allan Poe has been crowned the king of horror and Gothic fiction. The country most readily associated with this Gothic tradition is Germany, which comes as no surprise, given that both the German Romantic movement and the Proto-Romantic Sturm und Drang, or Storm and Stress, period helped to shape and influence Gothic fiction. Yet despite this evident connection, Poe's relationship to the German tradition was ambivalent. Towards the beginning of his career as a writer, Poe capitalized on what he must have considered the popular appeal of German horror by adding the subtitle, A Tale in Imitation of the German, to his tale Metzengerstein, when it was republished in the Southern Literary Messenger in 1836. So that's what you can see here on the slide. Scholars disagree about whether the story was meant to be read as a pure parody of what was commonly considered to be the German Gothic, or whether it in fact constitutes an exercise in mastering the craft of writing this genre. In any case, Poe was a shrewd businessman and knew how to present himself using the Gothic epithet to increase the marketability of the story. Despite this apparent initial interest in the Germanic and many instances of influence of both the German language and literature in his work, Poe became ever more reluctant to identify himself with Germany, famously declaring 4 years later in his preface for the Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque in 1840 that if in many of my productions terror has been the thesis, I maintain that terror is not of Germany but of the soul. He further stated that he, quote, deduced this terror only from its legitimate sources and urged it only to its legitimate results, unquote. Over time, Poe's anti-German position became ever stronger, resulting in the writer's total deprecation of German literature in a public statement in 1846 when he professed, I am not ashamed to say that I prefer even Voltaire to Goethe, and hold Macaulay, I don't know how to pronounce that, Macaulay, to possess more of the true critical spirit than Augustus William and Frederick Schlegel combined. Despite such vehement rejections of the German spirit, German sources and parallels to German writers pervade Poe's writing even after this statement. This mysterious ambivalence and negation of a tradition that clearly guided him is puzzling. A hoaxer by nature, Poe nonetheless wanted his reading public to believe that he mastered the language, interspersing quotations and Germanic names throughout his writing. Unfortunately, as Hansen and Pollen confirm in The German Face of Edgar Allan Poe, Poe's command of the language was not sufficient to read literary texts in the original, much less write flawless German sentences. In The Man of the Crowd, for instance, Poe makes what appears to be an unintentional grammatical error in his first sentence that is strong enough to make it incomprehensible to a German native. It was well said of a certain German book that lässt sich nicht lesen, it does not permit itself to be read. The German noun Buch is neuter, calling for the article s. This is just one of many examples of erroneous use of German. Thomas Dunn English, a former supporter of Poe with whom he had a falling out after the latter's slandering words in the caustic literati of New York City, exposed Poe's linguistic ignorance after the latter had labeled him a Windbeute, German for windbag. So these are Dunn's words, Dunn English's words. He professes to know every language and to be proficient in every science and art under the sun. His frequent quotations from languages of which he is totally ignorant and his consequent blunders expose him to ridicule, while his cool plagiarisms from known or forgotten writers excite the public amazement. According to Hansen and Pollen, Poe seems to have had no formal training in German. Though he attended one class at the University of Virginia with a renowned German professor by the name of Blättermann, it is unlikely that German was taught or spoken in the class. Poe's limited knowledge of German is further substantiated by prolific mistakes in his citations and erroneous or contrived use of the language, as exemplified by his choice of the exaggerated title and name, Metzengerstein, which would make any German smirk. According to Patrick Labriola, Poe likely gained access to German literature, and especially to Hoffmann's writings, through different sources, including translations of The Devil's Elixirs, Sir Walter Scott's essay on Hoffmann's use of the supernatural, and Carlyle's publication of the German Romance. These and other readings of his own in English translation form the basis of his knowledge of the Germanic. Moreover, let us remember that as an editor of prominent journals, Poe was exposed to many texts, many of which were influenced by European writers. Furthermore, he lived in Philadelphia, which was home to the greatest number of German immigrants at the time. Yet, despite such sprinkling of German words, places, or writers throughout his works, Poe, the master of angst, seems to have been haunted by a species anxiety of influence. In other words, by a need he sensed to defend himself from accusations of Germanisms. Why would Poe, who bent over backwards to feign knowledge of German that he did not have, want to distance himself from a Gothic literary tradition that seemed so akin to the nature of his works? One answer lies in the supposed link of the Transcendentalists, whom Poe claimed to despise, and German literature and philosophy. The word German was charged with pejorative connotations, often synonymous with mystical and transcendental. It appears that its meaning changed over time as it was increasingly affiliated with the transcendental Bostonian school as Poe's career evolved. This might explain why, while at first Poe seemed to readily identify with the label, gradually he would sense the budding need to defend himself from charges of Germanism, which he was often accused of. One might also speculate that these defensive statements served as a cover to conceal the German angst that haunted him to the extent that it became the underlying essence of his writing. In other words, Germany was so much a part of him that he had to revolt against it. This underlying angst is also discussed by Susan Bernstein, who cites a book titled Romanticism and the Gothic. Its author, Michael Gamer, points out that Romanticism partially defines itself by differentiating itself from the Gothic. In this relationship, Gamer writes, and here's the quote, "While Gothic's contentious reception constituted it as a conspicuously low form against which Romantic writers could oppose themselves, its immense popularity, economic promise, and sensational subject matter made this opposition a complex and ultimately conflicted and duplicitous endeavor. It is no accident that a considerable amount of early 19th century writing explicitly denies or otherwise deflects its association with the Gothic at its moments of closest kinship. If my primary interest is with these moments of adjacency and overlapping, it is because within them the Gothic perpetually haunts as an aesthetic to be rejected, Romanticism's construction of high literary culture." This seems to confirm that Poe, like his contemporaries, might have avoided any unnecessary association with the Gothic, despite, quote, moments of closest kinship, unquote, since it was considered to be a lower form, unlike highbrow Romanticism. Let us recall that the genre Gothic draws its name from the Goths, a Germanic people. According to the Norton Guide, quote, "In the context of the Romantic period, the Gothic is a type of imitation medievalism, which featured accounts of terrifying experiences in ancient castles, experiences connected with subterranean dungeons, secret passageways, flickering lamps, screams, graveyards, and the rest. By extension, it came to designate the macabre, mysterious, fantastic, supernatural, and again, the terrifying, especially the pleasurably terrifying," unquote. Before he wrote what is considered to be the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, in 1784, Horace Walpole remodeled his estate on Strawberry Hill in London, according to, quote, Gothic style, adding towers, arched doors, and ornaments, medieval style, unquote. His novel makes use of typically Gothic elements like a haunted castle, a Byronic villain by the name of Manfred, who preceded Byron's Manfred, mysterious deaths, and supernatural happenings. In The Literature of Terror, Volume 1, The Gothic Tradition, David Punter explores the rise of different literary realms of the Gothic. In the German tradition of Gothic fiction, the Schauerroman, in English that would be shutter novel, is analogous to the British Gothic novel. However, the German Schauerroman Romane, which is the plural, differ in that they are more pessimistic and complex, often dealing with secret societies. A genre innovator, Poe extends the boundaries of what one might call German Gothicism, focusing less on description than on the psychological disintegration of the soul. This is what Thompson would refer to as Poe's authentic American Gothic. Poe is careful to identify himself with the English rather than the German Gothic tradition, expressing his indebtedness to Anne Radcliffe in the Oval Portrait by mentioning her name, while he takes pride in being affiliated with the British Romantics Coleridge or Byron, yet distances himself from the German tradition. We will now explore the influence of the German spirit on Poe. First, I would like to discuss to what extent Poe's Gothic is rooted in the German tradition by tracing some general parallels. Then I will illustrate Poe's use of the German Lenore saga throughout his oeuvre, demonstrating his underlying profound affinity to Germanic sources. Poe's first published tale, Metzengerstein, which as stated before he would later enhance with the subtitle A Tale in Imitation of the German, caters to all the expectations of a German Gothic tale. That was this. It is set in Hungary, which, as Mabbott correctly points out, was at the time part of the Holy Roman Empire, and thus considered to be Germanic. This tale deals with the fall of two feuding German aristocratic families whose decaying castles are reminiscent of Walpole's castle of Otranto, and who are exposed to supernatural influences and a prophecy which ultimately lead to their demise. Poe heavily used all these typically German Gothic components for his story, exaggerating to the extent that some might read the tale to be a mere parody. However, Mabbott seems to agree with Quinn in his annotations when he states that, quote, "The story is no mere burlesque, but a powerful story of evil passions in a young man's soul," and remarks on superiority of Poe's use of the Gothic material to Walpole's absurd treatment. The tale is hardly burlesque at all, unless in reverse, but Poe and his early readers may have found the characters' names funny, unquote. He also chooses to cite Ed Winfield Parks, who in Edward Allan Poe as literary critic claimed that, quote, "Metzengerstein started as an imitation of the Gothic romances, but gathered such momentum that it became a powerful allegory, with evil leading to its own self-destruction," unquote. In Metzengerstein, the evil baron, Frederick von Metzengerstein, is carried away by a satanic horse which springs out of a tapestry and comes alive, presumably turning into his archenemy, Count Wilhelm von Bellitzingen, it's hard for even me to pronounce, who wants to avenge the death of his family. For the story implies that it was Frederick von Metzengerstein who set fire to the castle of the rival family, resulting in the extinction of the family line. The image of a horse that serves the devil is also part of the Lenore saga, but appears elsewhere in German literature as well, like in Goethe's famous ballad Erlkönig. And here we have a few other pictures. This is Metzengerstein on his horse, the satanic horse that takes him away. In Poe's tales, Gothic architecture, decaying buildings, palazzi, and catacombs, reminiscent of romantic ruins, abound. The fall of an aristocratic family and its ominous deteriorating mansion is perfectly exemplified by the fall of the House of Usher, where House of Usher refers both to the family and the mansion itself. In Ligeia, Poe's narrator meets his beloved Lady Ligeia in some large, old, decaying city near the Rhine being a river in Germany. Her family is well known and presumably aristocratic, all typical Gothic ingredients. The supernatural or magical is also an essential element of this tale, which recounts the narrator's second wife, Rowena's transformation into Ligeia. In his study, Proper Evidences of Madness, American Gothic and the Interpretation of Ligeia, Thompson discusses Poe's Ligeia, exploring whether or not the narrator witnesses an attempt at reincarnation or whether the transformation is merely imagined due to the influence of opium. He then inserts Ligeia into a framework of development of Gothic fiction from Germany to England and then to America, discussing typical characteristics of each type of Gothic. While for European Gothic writers, the purely terrible stood in stark opposition to the totally explained, the American Gothic relied more on ambiguous explanation of the supernatural. As mentioned above, for Thompson, Poe then exemplified the authentic American Gothic. In this American expression of the Gothic, an apparently supernaturalist tale relies on the psychological insights of a despairing mind that is never able to ascertain anything with complete certainty, analogous to the unreliability of Poe's narrators. Poe referred to Ligeia in some of his other tales as fantasy pieces, alluding to the German romantic writer he was often inspired by, Hoffmann, E.T.A. Hoffmann, who had published Fantasiestücke. So here you have that, Fantasiestücke. This is in Old German. Poe's use of the doppelganger motif, constitutes another example of the Germanic and specifically of Hoffmannian influence. William Wilson is clearly inspired by Hoffmann's The Devil's Elixirs of 1815. According to Patrick Labriola, while Poe claims to have borrowed the motive of the double in William Wilson from an article by Washington Irving, it is evident that he drew extensively on German literature for his short stories and sketches. Labriola demonstrates countless parallels between William Wilson and Hoffmann's The Devil's Elixirs, pointing out that the doppelganger motif is unique to German literature. So here you have a copy of a nice version of, this is a very typical German publication you'll find for most of the classics. If you see these little yellow books, they're about this big. It's called Reklam edition. Usually the cheapest versions too for students, so they're very popular in Germany because they're very tiny. Okay, now let us turn to Poe's use of the Lenore myth to acquire a deeper understanding of his relationship with Germany. Poe's frequent use of the motif of the romantic legend of the death of a beautiful maiden named Lenore gives us insight into his German Gothic heritage. The story of Lenore, also known by other names such as Leonore, Eleanor, Eleanor, or Helen, or Wilhelm and Helen, recounts the gory tale of a beautiful young maiden who loses her betrothed in a battle and who cannot cope with his loss, curses God, and expresses her fondest desire to be reunited with him at any cost. Soon thereafter, while she's preparing for bed, a revenant figure, a ghost with the appearance of her lover, appears, knocking at her chamber door, and wants to take her away with him on a horseback to what he claims is their wedding bed. Recall the parallel to the horse in Metzengerstein. You also have someone coming on horseback and, okay. Lenore is reluctant and skeptical about leaving in the middle of the night, but finally agrees. They ride through obscure nocturnal landscapes, followed by ravens, and finally arrive at the so-called wedding bed, which turns out to be a graveyard, the bed, the grave. Okay, the funeral rites are read, and Lenore joins her lover in the grave. So she believes they're going to her wedding bed, but in fact, he's taking her to the nearest cemetery there. Okay. Much like the Gothic tradition itself, the Lenore legend had its origins in Scotland or England, but then traveled to Germany and continental Europe before returning to the Anglo-Saxon realm. As we know in Poe's The Raven, the lyrical subject's deceased wife or lover also bears the name Lenore, which is an allusion to this saga, which the German poet Gottfried August Bürger recounted in his Lenore ballad of 1773. That was this, right here. Killis Campbell argues that Poe's heroine is a namesake of the heroine of the famous German ballad. Scholar Marty Lee underlines the lasting impact of Bürger's poem. Lenore, this is a quote, had tremendous influence on the literature of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and in fact, today's popular horror books and movies are still feeling the reverberations. In short, Bürger's achievement, while minor in itself, helped father an international movement that led directly to the massive popularity of Gothic works then and now. As the Gothic novel borrowed many of its original conventions from the German ballads as popularized by Lenore, we can fairly say that Bürger is one of the most influential founding fathers of the Gothic and horror genres. End quote. Though hardly remembered today, Burger's poem of 1773 was one of the key ballads of German Gothic proto-Romanticism, also known as Sturm und Drang, and like Goethe's Erlkönig, here, which followed in 1782, it was to have a profound influence on Romanticism. It's a very well-known poem, and there's also a very famous version of the Lied by Fischer-Dieskau. Schubert sort of set it to music, so you might want to check that out if you don't know it. It's, yeah, it's great. It seems that for Poe, using the Lenore motif constituted a deliberate attempt to both belong to and to nonetheless challenge the German literary heritage. Poe's recurrent use of the name Lenore in both his poems and tales demonstrates that, at least to some extent, he must have sensed a strong bond with this German tradition. However, his revision of, or deliberate use of variants of the name may also suggest that he may have wanted to make the reader aware of differences between his Lenore figures and those of his predecessors or contemporaries. Thomas Mabbott suggests in a footnote that Poe was aware of Burger's ballad since the latter casually mentioned it in a review in the Southern Literary Messenger of October 1836. However, Mabbott then proceeds to argue that the ballad did not serve as a model for Poe's own Lenore since, quote, in his reviews, Poe expresses no admiration for Burger's ballad, nor even indicates that he knew its theme, unquote. In reviews that appeared in that same issue of Southern Literary Messenger, Poe mentioned the fact that Mrs. Hemans and Sir Walter Scott admired Burger's ballad. Scott even wrote an adaptation of it with the title William and Helen, which Poe must have known since he reviewed some of Scott's works. Burger's version recounts the story of Lenore, who, as Mabbott states, refusing to be reconciled to the loss of her lover William in the Crusades, uttered such impious words as led his ghost to come and carry her off to his grave. End quote. However, Mabbott concludes that Poe's version is not comparable to that of Burger. Quote, what has this precious pair, Scott's, William and Lenore, to do with Poe's Guy de Vere and his gentle sweetheart? Unquote. That's Mabbott's idea, but it begs the question whether Poe's lack of discussion of Burger's poem is enough evidence to justify this conclusion. It is just as easy to assume that Poe was so familiar with the Burger poem, which was, after all, one of the key texts that inspired Romanticism, that he saw no need to prove that he was familiar with its contents. It is also possible that he deliberately refrained from expressing his admiration to avoid steering attention away from his own version of the legend. After all, Poe does mention the text in his reviews, and at the very least knew of its existence and that some of his contemporaries admired Burger's poem. Mabbott's assumption may be right, but it remains an assumption. Instead of taking Mabbott's words at face value, what if one were to assume that the opposite were true, namely, that Poe was very familiar with Burger's poem, and that his Lenore is an adaptation of the original, well-known theme? This, then, could serve as the point of departure for an analysis that will raise the question as to what extent Poe's version constitutes a continuation of the German Gothic heritage or represents a revision thereof. One must keep in mind that for Poe, Lenore is not just a poem. Lenore is also the absent subject, the lost lover of the raven, and the name Lenore recurs in other forms throughout Poe's work. After all, various English translations, William Taylor, Spencer, Sir Walter Scott, existed at the time, and the poem's title would have been attractive to Poe if he were to use it as a title for his own poem and if he were to use the name in different permutations. One could argue that Poe was indeed familiar with the source text and, using this as a point of departure, suggests its use as a tool to explore Poe's dialogue with the German Gothic. So now I'd just like to briefly discuss or compare Burger's poem, Burger's Lenore, that's what you might find in the handout if you took a look at it, to Poe's Lenore and to the Raven. So we'd like to compare that a little bit. Before we attempt to compare Burger's and William Taylor's translation and Poe's Lenore, we might want to consider why the Lenore saga appealed to Poe. As we know, Poe's life was marked by the death of all important women, except his Aunt Maria Clem, at a young and beautiful age. We also know that Poe used the name Helen, a version of Lenore, to refer to Jane Stannard Helen and Sarah Helen Whitman. We might speculate that Poe's biography influenced his aesthetic ideal, since for Poe the most poetical of subjects was the death of a young and beautiful woman. The Lenore saga really appealed to Poe, who used the name Lenore and many permutations thereof throughout his works. In addition to a poem he wrote titled Lenore, Poe's poem To Helen and his story Eleanor offer variants of the name and subject matter in their titles. One might also argue that Poe's recurrent and alliterative use of the consonant L throughout the corpus of his works is also reminiscent of Lenore. Annabelle, Lee, To Helen, Ligeia, Eleanor, Madeleine, and Morella, just to give you some examples. Poe seems to have had a penchant for female names that contained a sonorous L. In comparing Burger's and Poe's Lenore, one notices immediately that both poems bear the same title and deal with the Gothic romantic subject of the death of a beautiful maiden who finds her deathbed, where her funeral rites are read, and where she is buried. A similar tone, which is wrought with light sarcasm and reprimanding didacticism, can be detected. Both poems feature evil lovers. While in the case of Burger, William is egotistical, returning as a revenant to steal his bride, in Poe's Lenore, Guy de Vere is more of a modern anti-hero in that he is indifferent to his lover's death. A moralistic undertone is inherent in both poems. In Burger's ballad, this is particularly strong. Lenore is punished by death for having committed hubris since she challenged God to bring back her beloved. There are also some direct intertextual parallels. Burger's Rabenhaar becomes Poe's raven hair. Raven hair stands in the earliest version of Poe's Lenore. Of course, the poems also differ in some respects. Poe's Lenore is not written in ballad form, and innovative as Poe is, he introduces an element of comic relief. While the Romantics embraced death, Poe deliberately shattered commonplace expectations of the Gothic genre by introducing an indifferent lover who does not shed a tear at the deathbed of his beloved, but whose name, Guy de Vere, clearly alludes to the Latin veritas, or truth. One would hence expect him to be a true lover, but instead he's hypocritical. While Burger's Lenore is punished for her sin, Poe's Lenore is portrayed as a victim of her illness, a young and beautiful woman who died prematurely, and Guy de Vere is depicted as the cold-hearted lover. Now I'd briefly like to compare Lenore to the Raven. One of the leading genres of Romanticism was the romance, text with a novelesque character like the ballad, a poem which recounted a story. Ballads were also very popular and dealt with romantic or Gothic themes like the sublime, awe, or with the death of a young and beautiful maiden. When one thinks of Burger's Lenore, another comparison that comes to mind is Poe's Raven. One of the prominent features of Burger's ballad that one can also find in Poe's balladic Raven is the revenant figure, the lover who has risen from the dead, a typical romantic subject. In Poe's version, a raven replaced the revenant, providing comic relief. Both poems are rhyming ballads that feature a predominating O sound and the use of dialogue. In Burger's version, Lenore speaks with both her mother and William. In The Raven, the student converses with a raven in what might be considered to be a tragicomical, self-deprecating monologue. In both poems, the menace comes from without. The student in The Raven is inside and afraid of sounds outside, just as Lenore in Burger's ballad is afraid of the danger that lurks outside. Finally, in both cases, death, or the memory of death, comes from the exterior, answering the melancholy calls of the protagonists, yet shattering the safety of their inner worlds. Of course, we still find some important differences. Poe's introduction of a raven into the romantic setting of a Lenore cycle poem challenges the unquestionable sublime or supernatural context so characteristic of Romanticism. Poe's ballad is sarcastic to the point that it fringes upon being a parody. In conclusion, Poe's novelties include figures that provide comic relief, like an indifferent lover who appears to be true, Guy de Vere, but who does not sob for his dead bride, and a talking raven who seems to mock the protagonist's sorrow in The Raven. Death, which is brought about by a revenant figure in Burger's version, is replaced by an anticlimactic raven. This gives Poe's ballad a very modern touch. The raven itself is no menace, but the attribution of meaning on the part of the student to the raven's meaninglessly uttered nevermore is what makes the poem haunting. Thus, affinities between these ballads abound, and Poe's seems a psychological rendition of the Bergian model. Burger's title becomes the name of the deceased heroine in Poe's poem, the object of the desperate narrator's desire. It appears then that given so many parallels, Mabbitt's contention that Poe was unfamiliar with Burger's text is questionable. If Poe did not use Burger's original as a model, then why did he mention it in the first place? If Poe intended to write a poem called Lenore, he would surely have read every poem he could find with that title. One might also ask what other reasons might have prompted Poe's recurring use of variants of this theme and of this name in his writing. After all, he does employ various permutations of the name Lenore throughout his work. Eleonora, the title of one of his tales, is just one example, as is Helen. According to Mabbitt, Poe's Lenore, the heroine's name, changed only after Poe reworked an earlier poem into its new 1842 version. In the earlier 1836 version, the soon-to-be Lenore was still called Helen. Apparently, in 1848, Poe gave Sarah Helen Whitman a copy of the Broadway Journal, wherein he had written Helen, Ellen, Eleanor, Lenore, suggesting that all of these variants were versions of the same name. As already mentioned, Poe even referred to Jane Sanders as Helen, evoking and intentionally exaggerating the mysterious biographical connection that he had with the symbolic meaning of the name. Etymologically, the name Lenore and its variants mean light, prompting the reader to reflect on the symbolic meaning of this attribution. Was Poe suggesting that his Lenores or Helens served as a guiding light in his life? As for the literary implications of using various versions of Lenore, was Poe using a name that meant light to enlighten his readers by reshaping outdated notions of German Gothic Romanticism, or was he passing on the torch of his predecessors? Certainly, it was no coincidence that Poe considered the death of a young and beautiful woman to be the most romantic and tragic of subjects. He famously proclaimed that in the philosophy of composition, when it most closely allies itself to beauty, the death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, and equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such a topic are those of a bereaved lover. Perhaps it was Poe's anxiety of Germanic influence that spurned his own angst, making him the master of Gothic horror. The country and culture he feared most to be identified with fears him not, instead delighting in the angst his writing still instills. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Now I'd like to introduce our third speaker. Dr. Philip Edward Phillips is Professor of English and Associate Dean of the University Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University. His work on Poe appears in Approaches to Teaching Poe's Prose and Poetry, Edgar Allan Poe in Context, Deciphering Poe, Subtext, Context, Subversive Meanings, Poe Studies, and the Edgar Allan Poe Review. His online exhibition, Baudelaire's Poe, Selections from the W.T. Bandy Collection, curated with Emily James and Erica Rogers, was launched on January 19th of this year. He recently participated in the unveiling of Stephanie Rottnack's statue, Poe Returning to Boston, in the city of the poet's birth. He is the president of the Poe Studies Association. Please welcome Dr. Phillips.
Although Edgar Allan Poe's famous detective tales, The Purloined Letter and Murders in the Rue Morgue, featuring the brilliant C. Auguste Dupin, are set in Paris, Poe never traveled to France. And yet, to the French, he is one of their own. Edgar Poe owes his place in both the literary pantheon and in the public imagination to Charles Baudelaire. Edgar Allan Poe's influence in France has been profound because of Baudelaire's masterful translations of Poe's work into French. Baudelaire is best known to most readers as the author of the first masterpiece of modern poetry, Les Fleurs du Mal, 1857. Interestingly, Baudelaire believed that he had discovered a true double in Poe, whose works and aesthetic theories influenced his own works and thought. Because of Baudelaire's famous biographical essay on Poe and his translations of his works, Poe's literary influence would extend to other French authors, notably Stéphanie Mallarmé and Paul Valéry, and play a vital role in the emergence of the symbolist movement in Europe. During an age in which Poe's works were misunderstood and unappreciated in America, owing partly to Rufus Griswold, curse his name, Baudelaire would introduce Poe to France, Europe, and indeed to the rest of the world. Despite his recognition as a literary critic, known in America as the Tomahawk Man, and as a popular writer of tales in the 1830s and 40s, and eventually as the celebrated author of The Raven in 1845, Poe's popular reception in America was mixed at best during his own lifetime. Poe's contentious, if one-sided, Longfellow Wars, his disputes with the literary establishment of New England, whose members he termed the Frogpondians, and his reactions in print in the aftermath of his somewhat disastrous appearance at the Boston Lyceum in 1845 did much to diminish his already tenuous reputation in his final years. Nevertheless, with the publication of his prose poem, Eureka, on the material universe, the income generated from more invited speaking engagements, his new membership in the Sons of Temperance, and the prospect of editing his own journal again, the year 1849 appeared to hold some promise for Poe. What proved to be the most influential and harmful blow to Poe's reputation in America, however, was Rufus Griswold's October 9, 1849 Ludwig obituary in the New York Tribune, which was followed by his scathing memoir, eventually included in his 4-volume The Works of the Late Edgar Allan Poe. Griswold's misrepresentations, forgeries, and malicious slanders would be accepted as accurate accounts of Poe's life and character for over a century, and we've heard some of those descriptions already. All of this despite the efforts of Sarah Helen Whitman and others who tried in vain to defend Poe's reputation. Paradoxically, it was Charles Baudelaire and his representations of Poe which reveled in the idea of Poe as a genius imprisoned within an unsympathetic and unappreciative American culture that caused Poe's reputation as a serious artist to take hold in France and Europe. According to W.T. Bandy, France was the first European country to show an interest in Poe. While some scattered translations of Poe had appeared in France as early as 1844, including an imitation of William Wilson published in a Paris newspaper, Baudelaire chanced in 1847 to see some of those translations and was deeply affected by them, recognizing in their author a kindred spirit. He immediately procured a copy of the Wiley and Putnam edition of Poe's Tales, from which he translated Mesmeric Revelation for the July 1848 issue of La Liberté de Penser. According to Baudelaire's critical biographer, Claude Pichois, the years 1847 to 1848 remain relatively mysterious because of the scarcity of documentation. But it was during this time that Baudelaire was exploring various philosophical systems in order to confirm for himself the existence of some kind of unity or harmony that would come to inform his own poetry. Indeed, in the introduction to his translation of Mesmeric Revelation, Baudelaire expresses an admiration for Balzac, who attempted to combine the ideas of diverse philosophers to create his own unifying vision. And he notes that Poe, too, was also haunted by the idea of unity. Baudelaire's unorthodox artistic and philosophical curiosity led him to Poe, and his profound identification of himself with Poe inspired, even compelled Baudelaire to read and translate Poe. While Poe was not entirely unknown in France when Baudelaire began his works, that is, a translation of The Black Cat had appeared in La Démocratie Pacifique at the end of January 1847, Baudelaire's growing admiration for Poe as a reactionary, a mystic, a visionary, and a creator of fantastic tales in which nothing is left to chance, led to his own translations, which would introduce Poe not only to France, not only to Europe, but indeed to the world. Baudelaire was attracted to Poe as an artist for whom works of literature were not the products of frenzied inspiration, but rather calculated design. Baudelaire recognized in Poe a quality that he possessed himself, recounting, quote, "In 1847, I came upon a few fragments of Edgar Allan Poe and felt a strange sort of shock. Since his complete works were not collected in a single edition until after his death, I was patient enough to make the acquaintance of some Americans living in Paris so that I could borrow collections of newspapers which Poe had edited. And then I discovered, believe me if you will, poems and stories that I had already thought of. Amazing. But of which I had only a vague, confused, and disorganized idea, and which Poe had managed to put together and perfect. That was the start of my enthusiasm and long labor," end quote. It was indeed a long labor, because Baudelaire's translations of Poe, which did not begin to appear until the end of 1852, represented Baudelaire's largest and most sustained literary activity until shortly before his death in 1867. In total, his translations of Poe filled 5 volumes. Here's one of them, the Histoire Extraordinaire, the Nouvelle Histoire Extraordinaire, Pym, Eureka. This is testament enough in itself to his dedication to Poe, that he translated this very serious work of science and aesthetics. And then the Histoire grotesque et sérieuse. Although their years of activity overlapped to a degree, Baudelaire and Poe never met or corresponded. One can only imagine what would have been the outcome of their artistic conversations. Friend and biographer Charles Asselineau captures the degree of Baudelaire's obsession with learning anything and everything about Poe in his first-hand account. Quote, "No matter who he, Baudelaire, was with, and wherever he was, in the street, in a cafe, at the printer's, morning or evening, he always asked the same question. 'Do you know Edgar Allan Poe?' And depending on the reply, Baudelaire would either give vent to his enthusiasm or plague his listener with further inquiries," end quote. Baudelaire credits Poe as one of the great writers who taught him how to think. When presenting Poe to others, Baudelaire was presenting himself. When thinking of Poe, Baudelaire was thinking of himself. Indeed, Poe was for Baudelaire his other self, his mirror image or ideal artistic self. In 1852, Baudelaire published Edgar Allan Poe, Sa vie et ses ouvrages in the Revue de Paris for March and April of 1852, a liberal, progressive paper that was receptive to the work of new writers. According to Bandy, this essay, quote, inaugurated Baudelaire's campaign to make of the American writer a great man for France, end quote. 4 years later, Baudelaire would modify this essay and use it as the preface to his translations of Poe. Baudelaire's essay, which later became the preface to his works of Poe, is arguably the most widely known study of an American author. It was reprinted often and translated into almost every language. Baudelaire's representation of Poe neutralized, so far as Europe was concerned, the effect of Griswold's vindictive memoir, which had so negatively influenced American readers. It established in its place a passionate defense of Poe, the poet, that would guarantee him a prominent place among the pantheon of France's greatest writers. In his essay From Poe to Valérie, 1948, poet and critic T.S. Eliot noted that, quote, in France, the influence of his poetry, Poe's poetry, and of his poetic theories has been immense, end quote, a fact that he found puzzling. Despite Eliot's dismissive assertion, quote, that Poe had a powerful intellect is undeniable, but it seems to me the intellect of a highly gifted person before puberty, end quote, quote. He nevertheless concedes in his conclusion, quote, I find that by trying to look at Poe through the eyes of Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and most all of Valéry, that I become more thoroughly convinced of his importance, of the importance of his work as a whole, end quote. Eliot had observed earlier that, quote, these French readers were impressed by the variety of form of expression in Poe's work because they found or thought they found an essential unity, end quote. And indeed, it was that sense of unity later identified by Claude Pichois, as well as his interest in Poe as poète maudit, with which Baudelaire had identified personally. Patrick F. Quinn, author of The French Face of Edgar Allan Poe, like Eliot, acknowledged the extraordinary influence of Poe in France, but he questioned the French appreciation of Poe, thinking it to be misguided. Quinn could not believe that Poe was included in the pantheon of writers preserved in the Pléiade editions, which we have here, which are, for those of you familiar with the Library of America editions here in the States, these are the equivalent, and being published in one of these volumes constitutes your place in the hierarchy. Baudelaire's works was the first printed volume. The second printed volume was Baudelaire's translations of Poe. And those are ahead of Racine and Voltaire and Stendhal. So that gives you an idea of the place afforded to Poe through Baudelaire. Nor could he, going back to Quinn, initially believe the high esteem in which Poe was held throughout Europe. Initial inquiries led him to believe it all to be a grand hoax perpetuated by Charles Baudelaire, quote, the man who, on the subject of Poe, had led France and most of Europe up the garden, end quote. Quinn's studies in France, however, ultimately led him to different conclusions. By comparing Baudelaire's translations with Poe's original texts, Quinn concluded that, quote, by participating in the French response to Poe, it becomes possible to bring a new and enlarged understanding, end quote, to Poe. In respect to the question of whether the French poet improved upon Poe's original text in his translations, Quinn concludes that in some specific cases, Baudelaire did strengthen Poe's syntax and diction, but that in other cases he did not, especially those passages that contained expressions that would have been particularly difficult for a non-native speaker of English. Quote, it would be mistaken to conclude that Poe's translations as a whole represent a decided improvement upon their originals. Baudelaire did not melt down these stories, remove their dross, and recast them in the pure gold of his French. He could have done so, perhaps, but his admiration for Poe's work was too intense, his identification with the man too complete, to allow him to contemplate such an experiment in literary metallurgy, end quote. Indeed, Baudelaire did not think he could improve upon Poe's poetry, which he greatly admired, and his drive to translate Poe's prose seemed to have been motivated by his desire to know Poe as he was. Aside from the poems included within the body of the tales or essays, such as The Conqueror Worm, The Haunted Palace, and The Raven, and his dedicatory poem to Maria Clem, Poe's sonnet to my mother, Baudelaire refused to translate the poetry of his master, Poe, leaving that task instead later to Stéphane Mallarmé and others. According to Lois Davis Vines, editor of Poe Abroad, quote, not only did Baudelaire's translations and essays introduce Poe into European literature, but they also played an important role in his becoming known throughout the world, especially in Asia and Latin America, end quote. As her groundbreaking collection illustrates, most non-English speaking Europeans were introduced to Poe by Baudelaire. Indeed, many of the earliest of Poe's translators worked directly from Baudelaire's text. Just a few of the European versions based on Baudelaire include Constantin Balmont's translations into Russian, translations into Italian, translations into Croatian, Polish, Spanish, Portuguese. I'm not going to go down the list of all of these, but they're all, many of them are enumerated in the study Poe Abroad. there are many other examples. Clearly, the study of Poe's influence and his influence via Baudelaire upon European literature is a fertile ground for research, as the studies by such scholars as Renata Filipov, Margarita Valle-Gato, and Imran Esplin amply demonstrate. In addition to these early translations and the enormous literary influence exerted by Poe's works on various writers worldwide, Baudelaire's translations also inspired and continue to inspire many wonderful illustrated editions. Poe's profound influence in France, Europe, and the rest of the world is deeply indebted to his French translator, Charles Baudelaire. W.T. Bandy devoted a lifetime of study to Baudelaire and was equally fascinated with these two figures on two sides of the Atlantic, whose lives and artistic visions were inseparably intertwined. Baudelaire's essay, Edgar Allan Poe, Sa vie et ses ouvrages, and his translations of Poe's prose works remain monuments of world literature whose influence remains to be more fully appreciated. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I encourage you to take a look at the exhibition that has just been opened online at the W.T. Bandy Center. Thank you.
All right, and now I would like to introduce our respondent for today. Arlo Hall is an MA student in the Department of English at Middle Tennessee State University. He is scheduled to defend his thesis, A Quick Immortal Change, Milton's Metamorphosed Virtue in a Masque presented at Ludlow Castle, 1634, in spring 2015. Also the author of an original masque, which was performed recently at the MTSU Foundation House, Mr. Hall is applying his research on the masque genre to an innovative study of Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. He is a member of the Poe Studies Association. Please welcome Arlo.
Thank you. So I guess I'd like to ask one question sort of for all three of you. In terms of Poe as a nowhere man and an everywhere man, and in terms of Poe's existence in different places, whether it be in his mind, in the reader's mind, to what degree do you think, can we attribute any of this to Poe's intention? To what degree can we call Poe an intentional everywhere man, or someone who intentionally places himself in St. Petersburg? And to what degree do we have to consider that a matter of accident?
As for St. Petersburg, it was definitely not an accident, for sure, because that was his fictional invention, and I guess he just, I'm sure that he just wanted to, well, that's pretty obvious. I mean, that's a pretty trivial answer, but as regards St. Petersburg and Greece, apparently that was his fallen Byron's cult, and his desire to appear, say, more European than American, or at least to expand. Well, because he that's obvious, he never traveled in his lifetime, like, except for the childhood time in England, so, well.
I think he was a person who wanted to belong and wanted to be part of a place, and it's a very rich question that you ask. We can only scratch the surface, but being someone who was the son of actors, who was orphaned at a very young age, and then was taken into the household of John and Frances Allen, but never formally adopted. He was part of a Southern genteel culture to which he felt he belonged on the one hand, but on the other always felt marginalized on a very personal level, particularly with John Allen. He always carried himself as a gentleman, and even in his impoverished adulthood, could mix in many circles, but he was always on the outside at the same time. So he was part of something, and then he was outside of that. And so these interesting fabrications of the being involved in fighting for Greek independence as part of his expression of his identification with Byron, and also his desire to kind of, to push the envelope a little bit to create a more interesting story. He fed this information to people, and then they repeated it, so it sounded like it was true. And he had to compete with the other authors of his time period, many of whom were very wealthy and could afford to devote themselves to poetry as a leisure activity. Whereas Poe earned his living as a writer and worked very, very hard. So.
Yeah, and sometimes he also didn't want to be associated with a certain group, like his contentious relationship with Boston, the city of Boston, and the Transcendentalists, and many scholars believe that in fact some of his philosophy was pretty akin to that of the Transcendentalists, and he likes to sort of play with that image of belonging or not belonging to a place, as I attempted to illustrate in the case of Germany as well, but that would apply to Boston. Although with the French, for example, I think he liked for people to believe that he'd been to France as well, and that was another sort of an interesting interplay there, because I'm also sort of studying the relationship of Poe and Baudelaire, and there too, he likes to sort of get people to believe that he was in part French. If you look at some of his, that's why the French venerate Poe to such an extent, and that's why a lot of his tales you can also find he does much the same as he does with German. The German language, although Poe is, much better at French than at German, but he also intersperses all sorts of French terms and French names and streets, like the Rue Morgue, and so it's interesting to think about that as well.
And there was this out of space, out of time quotation, if you remember, from Poe. So he really liked posing himself this way. But I guess that the effects of that were ambivalent, because on the one hand, sure, he became like person appreciated worldwide. On the other hand, it took years for Americans to actually appreciate Poe as an American writer, and it's not a coincidence, I guess, that Patrick Queen's The French Face of Edgar Allan Poe was published, if I'm not mistaken, in 1957, or like in the 1950s, whilst the American Face of Edgar Allan Poe by Steve Rackman and Sean Rosenheim saw light only in the late 90s, 1990s, so you can see, right, so, and now Poe is seen as central to American antebellum canon, only now, but it took almost like 2 centuries to understand that.
Yeah. That's a great point.
And I did want to point out another French connection. So obviously Poe's French was far superior to his German. He actually studied French. He did very well in his French classes and could very likely read French well. I don't know how well he spoke French, but I'm sure he could read. He could read French. His grandfather, David Poe Sr., was called. His nickname was General Poe, and he had contributed to the cause of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And when Lafayette visited the United States, one of the people he wanted to meet was the widow of General Poe, and to thank her and to acknowledge her late husband's service. An earlier French connection was when Poe was in Richmond as a young man. He was part of a junior militia, and actually was part of the group of young men who were there when Lafayette proceeded through the city. So maybe those things too help to contribute to the French appreciation for Poe, even though they're very minor.
Mm-hmm.
Could you each say a couple of words about the current reception of Poe in Germany and in Germany and in Russia? Is he? We know how he's seen in France at this point, but I'm not sure how he would be seen in Russia or in Germany at this point.
You mean reception, critical reception, or because like talking about Poe in Russia generally, I mean, he's really one of the American writers who would be widely read. And just to compare, like I guess Russian students would read more Poe tales even than American students. But like there would be different tales. Like in the United States, it will be first of all the Telltale Heart, right, for kids and for students, while in Russia it would be the Golden Bug. Because again, there's the whole history of the gold bug and its reception in Russia that kind of influenced this. So I mean, he will be widely read, widely appreciated. While as for Poe criticism in Russia, I don't think it is that developed, unfortunately. I mean, there are still some things being on, but I guess. I wouldn't say there is some current tendency of interpreting Poe this way or the other way. I mean,
Yeah, in Germany, it's very hard to find someone who's not familiar with Poe, and who hasn't read at least some of his works. And it does belong. Poe does belong to the canon of. Most people have a copy of Poe's tales. On their bookshelves as well. Nice. Sometimes The Raven is not quite as well known as it is here. I find that people here tend to know The Raven before they know his tales, whereas in Germany it's the opposite. So that's sort of interesting to observe. And there is a lot of new scholarship on Poe emerging in Germany, and a lot of it also deals with sort of the Gothic element of Poe's works, and his influence, of course, his lasting influence in Germany. He has inspired, many authors to this day.
You mentioned the philosophy of composition in which he claims to have. He tries to retrace his steps through writing The Raven, and he talks about the choice of nevermore and the sonorous sound of ore. I suppose that given your talk, you would probably take him as tongue-in-cheek at this point, given the name Lenore and the importance of the name Lenore for the Gothic tradition. That there's got to be no way that he chose that for its sound in and of itself, as he would claim.
No, definitely not. Yeah, I think that was also that. It's just so typical. He likes to play with his target audience, sort of seeing to what extent people are gullible, but also deliberately playing things down, as is the case with the philosophy of composition. I believe he sort of plays it down deliberately because he revealed a little bit too much about his method, and so he claimed that it was to be considered a hoax in a letter, and so it's sort of doubtful. You might, at the very least, think about whether or not one should take it seriously or not. But it's definitely very contentious among scholars,
And yet there is some truth in it as well. His interest in the sound and the ability of sound to convey meaning. And that would be one of the things that Baudelaire admired about Poe, and one of the reasons why he not only didn't, but refused to translate most of the poems into French, that he had a respect for the sound of poetry and the meaning in sound.
Yeah, I don't think he felt up to that yet. I mean, he went out of his way and bent over backwards to improve his English so that he was able to translate Poe. And you can actually trace sort of the development of his translations. At the beginning, his English is not nearly as good as towards the end. So that's sort of interesting to observe as well, the different editions of the translations. And
Dr. Yurkova, I think that you discussed the Man in the Crowd and the Nevka project, the Nevsky project. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
What was the title of it
The
again?
Nevsky Prospect. That's the
Nevsky
main street in St. Petersburg.
Could you discuss the comparison a little bit more between those two? Is it, well, I guess if you could talk a little bit more about that at all. Is it just a physical location, or are the two stories connected?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I just didn't have much time to compare the stories, but actually, I wrote an essay for Barbara Cantaluper's collection on The Man of the Crowd and Gogol's The Portrait. That's another tale belonging to Gogol's St. Petersburg tales. And I mean, it's very odd, but both of these tales, The Portrait and The Nevsky Prospect, they're somehow intertwined with Poe's The Man of the Crowd. And as you asked about The Nevsky Prospect, I guess, well, if you read the tales together, you would be struck from the very beginning that they begin like, okay, in Poe's tale, there is the narrator, a flaneur who is sitting in a London cafe and watches the crowd. In Gogol's tale, there is no narrator, I mean, no person, there is a narrator, but now like personalized narrator, but still there is the description of the crowd as if seen by the flaneur, and like both tales, they open with the description of the crowd, and as I try to say, this description of the crowd is very similar because it is depersonalized. It is in Poe case, it is represented as a parade of these automatons of masks. It's very like Walter Bannerman, another great German reader of Poe. He kind of shows the extent to which Poe makes the grotesque out of the crowd, and so does Gogol, who metonymically reduces the crowd to all these hats, noses, mustaches. So, I mean, this coincides. Then what happens in Poe's tale? Then after watching the crowd, he sees the old man and he starts chasing him. The same in Gogol's tale, because after this extended long description of the Nevsky Prospect, there are two young men who start pursuing two women. And the point that really interests me is that sure, like Gogol has this kind of erotic love story plot in both cases, while in Poe's case, instead, there is a man chasing another man, and there is actually a great essay that I love by a Lee person called Queer Poe, where he reads this tale as an example of some of Poe's homoeroticism, and he's very persuasive in his reading. So I mean, and these tales could be also compared from this point of view, and as I also try to say, they both end up with this utter disappointment. In Gogol's case, it leads to tragedy because one of the young men, he takes a prostitute for a romantic heroine, and when he discovers that she doesn't want to join him to leave her profession, he commits suicide, while the other guy who was just looking for some affair, he instead encounters this virtuous German housewife, and he gets totally disappointed. But like in Poe's tale, we also were left with this kind of frustration at the end of the tale because we still were not getting at the mystery of the old man, and this is also a point of convergence, but also a point of difference, because in Gogol's tales, okay, the gas lamps, they're deceptive, but finally we know what these beautiful strangers were, while in Poe's tales we're left with this other mystery, and we wonder if there was any mystery at all. So I mean, I guess that it's interesting just to cross-read these tales, because they were really, there is no question of mutual influence, but they like the flaneur figure appears overtly in Poe's and covertly in Gogol's tales at the same time. And I mean, I'm sure that could also be read with some of Hoffman's tales and some of Baudelaire's like sketches or whatever later. So thank you.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.
That's okay.